Alice never considered herself an ordinary woman. From a young age, she felt an intense need for control. She was always drawn to moments when she could dictate the rules and watch others dance to her tune. But this desire took on darker forms as she grew older and faced the harsh reality of a world where women were often used and disrespected. Several traumatic moments, especially one when her partner treated her with utter contempt, shaped her view of life, making her colder and more unforgiving. After that, Alice made a decision. She would never let anyone have power over her again. She wouldn't just seek control, she would destroy. Her secret club became the embodiment of this philosophy. The women who joined had different stories. Former victims of domestic abuse, humiliation, or even sexual assault. But now, together, they were creating a new reality, one where they became the hunters and men the prey. They used games of cruelty to regain control, manipulating their victims and pushing them to their limits. Some men were also part of the club, but they were a specific group, those who had also suffered from male cruelty. These men didn't just support the idea of dominance. They actively participated in the sadistic cycle. For them, it was a chance to reclaim their dignity by humiliating others, mirroring the abuse they once endured. Alice was obsessed with the idea of absolute power. It wasn't just about physically dominating a man. She wanted to watch as the last drop of his dignity vanished, as his inner world crumbled. She believed that only in moments of extreme vulnerability do people reveal their true selves. The videos they recorded and sold as elite content were proof of her triumph. Each film was like a trophy, a piece of her grand canvas, a world where she and her partners held all the power. Now, with Ross in her sights, Alice knew he would be the next addition to her collection. He was exactly the kind of man who disrespected women, an ideal target for her plan. She saw the contempt in his eyes, his readiness to belittle the weak. For Alice, it was a challenge, to break him and prove that even men like him are vulnerable. And the sweetest part? She would do it so seamlessly that he wouldn't realize he was trapped until it was too late. When they agreed to meet, Ross had no idea this party would mark the beginning of his end. Alice planned everything down to the finest detail. The party would look just like any other, charming on the surface but filled with twisted games, cruelty, and chaos behind closed doors. Ross would be the main attraction for the evening, and once he set foot in this world, there would be no turning back. Alice ensured that all the guests received their invitations, especially those who would make sure Ross wouldn't even think about escaping if he sensed danger. She knew the first impression was crucial, and she would do everything to make him believe in her kindness and desire to have a good time. When Alice walked toward Ross at the restaurant, a charming smile lit her face. From that moment, everything was already decided. The pieces were in place and the game was about to begin. At the restaurant, over a glass of red wine, Alice watched Ross relax. He laughed at her jokes and seemed ready to trust her completely. She seduced him subtly, step by step, slowly wrapping him in her web. When they arranged to meet again at a special party, Ross had no idea that his last night of freedom had already begun. Tomorrow, he would cross the threshold into a place where he no longer made the rules, where those who had already sealed his fate were waiting. The luxurious mansion, where the party was supposed to take place, stood isolated from the city, hidden among thick trees. Tall wrought iron gates slowly opened, and Ross drove into the spacious courtyard, where expensive cars glimmered under the soft glow of lanterns. The mansion looked perfect. Large windows shone with warm light, and the sounds of jazz and laughter drifted from the open doors. Everything seemed elegant and inviting, the kind of place where worries could easily be forgotten. Alice was waiting by the entrance, giving Ross a playful wink. She looked flawless. A sleek black dress, bold red lipstick, and a scent so intoxicating it made his head spin. She greeted him with a light kiss on the cheek and took his hand. Her touch was warm, and her voice carried promises of a delightful evening. "The night's just beginning," she whispered, leading him inside. The mansion's interior was breathtaking. Soft light from chandeliers cascaded onto the marble floor. Mirrors reflected the flickers of candlelight, and the air was thick with the scent of fine cigars and wine. Guests floated around, men and women in elegant attire, chatting casually and laughing like old friends. At first glance, it looked like a typical gathering for the wealthy. Stone-faced waiters carried trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. A live jazz band played smooth tunes, adding to the carefree atmosphere. Feeling in his element, Ross grabbed a glass and winked at a passing waitress, who quickly lowered her gaze and hurried off. He liked being here, sensing that the night promised more than just conversation. But something felt off. Alice was unusually attentive, constantly checking to make sure Ross was comfortable. The guests seemed a bit too perfect, smiles too polished, stares lingering a little too long. Ross dismissed the unease, lifting his wine glass and flirting with one of the women in attendance. Hours later, with alcohol running through his veins, Ross became bolder. Spotting the same waitress who had been serving him all night, he grabbed her by the wrist, his voice slurred and demanding. "Bring me more wine, sweetheart." The girl lowered her eyes, visibly nervous. At that moment, Alice appeared by his side. Her smile remained serene, but there was a coldness in her eyes that made even Ross feel uneasy. "I think you've had enough," she said, gently taking the empty glass from his hand. "Come on, I want to show you something." She slipped her arm through his and led him down a long corridor. Ross thought this was just another surprise from Alice, who seemed more alluring with every display of confidence and control. But the farther they walked, the quieter it became, and a creeping sense of dread began to take hold. The corridor they entered was eerily silent, more unsettling than any noise. The ceiling felt low, and the soft glow from the lamps gave the space a suffocating feel. Ross followed Alice, trying to hide his growing discomfort. Something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on what. "Right through here," she said with a faint smile, opening a door. Beyond the door was an entirely different world. Not a grand hall, but a dim, cold room that looked more like a basement or a storage space. Inside, the faint outlines of people were visible, chained to chairs. A puddle on the floor, suspiciously dark, glimmered under the weak light, and the soft clink of chains echoed as someone shifted. One man's mouth was gagged, but his muffled sobs were still audible. Another sat motionless, as if resigned to whatever was coming next. Ross froze, panic slowly creeping into his mind. He turned to Alice with a bewildered look. She stood calmly beside him, wearing the same tranquil smile. "Something wrong?" she asked, as if they had merely walked into the wrong room by mistake. Ross opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Alice pulled out a small vial and uncorked it. A sharp, pungent smell filled his lungs before he realized what was happening. His head spun, and his legs gave way beneath him. His body refused to obey as the world blurred around him. "Everything's going to be fine, Ross," she whispered into his ear as his consciousness faded. The last thing he saw was her face, calm, satisfied, almost motherly, like a parent tucking their child into bed. When Ross came to, he found himself strapped into a heavy leather chair, secured by thick belts. The room was dimly lit, and a camera sat on the table in front of him, pointed directly at his face. Shadows moved around him. Someone stepped closer, and Ross heard soft, mocking laughter. He tried to struggle, but the straps held him tight, like a trap with no escape. And then Alice's voice drifted out of the darkness. "The game's just beginning, darling." Ross sat motionless, strapped to the chair, breathing in the thick, stale air. The dim lights cast weak shadows, barely outlining the room. Walls, an old fireplace, tables littered with bottles of liquor, and black cameras silently capturing every second. In the center of the room, several men knelt, helpless, chained to the floor. They flinched at every footstep, as if anticipating judgment. A few women moved among them with cruel grace. Slow touches, sadistic taunts, like cats toying with trapped mice. One man, barely out of his 20s, whimpered as two women ran their fingers through his hair, whispering strange, unsettling words. He begged them to stop, but his pleas only drew cold, empty laughter, void of any compassion. "Isn't this what you wanted?" One of the women leaned in close, her voice sharp as glass scraping metal. "Too late to change your mind now." Another man struggled against his chains, only to be forced down again. Cries and groans mixed with muffled blows and mockingly sweet words, turning the scene into something even more grotesque. Ross tried to look away, but the straps around his head kept him fixed in place, forcing him to witness it all. Alice stood nearby, watching with a faint smile, like a director admiring her own masterpiece. She reveled in every sob, every broken spirit, savoring the power she held over the room. But the worst part wasn't what Ross saw, it was what they didn't do to him. Every passing moment of inaction only amplified his fear. He couldn't understand why they left him untouched, and that uncertainty gnawed at him more than any physical pain could. Asterisk, why were they ignoring me? What are they planning? Asterisk, his mind spiraled into paranoia. Asterisk, are they saving me for something special? Am I supposed to be the grand finale of this sick show? Asterisk, cold sweat clung to his back, but he couldn't even wipe his face. All he could do was watch as the other men were broken mentally and physically, right before his eyes. Suddenly, Alice appeared beside him. She leaned in, her hand brushing through his hair, her voice a soft whisper in his ear. "Scared, aren't you? The worst part is not knowing what's coming." She ran her fingers along his cheeks, then lightly tapped his face, as if soothing a frightened child. "I'm saving you for dessert, Ross. Don't rush the fear. Things are just getting started." Her quiet, sinister laugh echoed as she walked away, leaving him alone in that nightmarish room. Ross felt himself sinking deeper into the pit of dread, each second dragging him further into the abyss. Asterisk, why aren't they touching me? What are they going to do? Asterisk. The questions tore at him, each unanswered second making the truth feel more terrifying than anything he could imagine. Ross sat frozen in the chair, paralyzed by fear, as Alice leaned in close, locking eyes with him. She twirled a strand of her hair between her fingers and smiled faintly. "Let's play a little game, Ross," she whispered, her voice sweet but laced with something cold. "One riddle. If you solve it, I'll let you go. If you don't, well, you'll be staying here for a very long time. Deal?" Ross nodded, knowing he had no other choice. "Listen carefully," she said, narrowing her eyes as if savoring the moment. "It walks without legs, strikes without hands, sees without eyes, and speaks without a tongue. What is it?" Panic churned in his chest. The riddle sounded absurd, but he desperately tried to find the answer. His heart pounded in his ears. What could it be? Then, suddenly, it hit him. A clock! Alice laughed. A real, genuine laugh. And to Ross's disbelief, she unbuckled the straps holding him down. "Congratulations, Ross. You're free." Shakily, he stood, casting nervous glances around the room. Was this some kind of trick? But nothing happened. The door stood open, waiting. Without hesitation, Ross stumbled outside and took a deep breath of the cool night air, relief washing over him. Inside, Alice watched him go, her expression calm, as if she were merely an observer in her own twisted game. Turning to the others, she said softly, "Let's give him a little head start. Then we begin the hunt." Ross made his way to the police station, still disbelieving his luck. Gasping for breath, he told the officer on duty everything. But the officer merely gave him a skeptical look. "So, you're telling me a bunch of women tortured men?" The officer raised an eyebrow. "And there's not a single bruise on you to prove it?" Ross felt the walls closing in. His words hit a wall of disbelief. And then the door opened, and in walked her, the waitress from the party. She smiled with a mocking glint in her eye. Well, Ross," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Another one of your stories?" A cold sweat broke out down Ross's back. He realized, in a horrifying instant, that there was no escape. He bolted from the station, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Behind him, he heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. She was following, not rushing, as if knowing he wouldn't get far. Ross ran until he reached a gas station, chest heaving. He darted into the restroom, locking the door behind him. Splashing cold water on his face, he tried to gather his thoughts. Asterisk, this can't be real. It's not over. They're everywhere. Asterisk. He stumbled back into the gas station's main area and grabbed a bottle of water. Slamming it on the counter, he stared at the cashier, his heart still racing. The cashier leaned in, a whisper brushing against his ear. "Run, Ross," she said softly. "I'll give you a 2-minute head start." The world spun. His legs moved before his mind could even process what was happening. Grabbing the bottle, he bolted out the door into the night. He ran down the empty highway, lungs burning. Then he heard the first gunshot. The bullet whizzed past his ear, and adrenaline surged through him. The second shot hit its mark. Pain exploded in his leg as he crumpled to the ground with a scream. From the darkness, the cashier emerged, walking toward him slowly, deliberately. She crouched beside him, a satisfied smile spreading across her face. "You gave up too easily, Ross," she said almost playfully. Without another word, she pulled a syringe from her pocket and injected something into his neck. Ross felt his limbs grow heavy, his mind slipping into fog. The last thing he saw was her indifferent gaze as the world around him faded into black. Ross woke up in a dimly lit room. His head was pounding, and his body felt heavy, as if filled with lead. He tried to move but quickly realized his arms and legs were tightly bound to a metal chair. His blurred vision struggled to focus on a lamp swinging from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted a familiar figure. It was Alice. Her face bore a cold, satisfied smile. "Awake, Ross?" she said, as if greeting an old friend. Around him sat other women from the club, their faces calm, as if they were at an ordinary gathering. On one of the screens on the wall, a video played, previous games showing bewildered, helpless men, broken both mentally and physically. At that moment, Ross understood. They used their cruel shows as merchandise for the black market. Hidden cameras in the corners were already recording his final moments. "You were a special guest. I told you you'd be perfect for this party," Alice said softly, stepping closer to him. Cold sweat trickled down Ross's back. But the worst part wasn't the chains, the cameras, or the merciless eyes watching him. What terrified him most was the delay. Why were they waiting so long? "You know what's funny, Ross?" Alice whispered, leaning closer. "You're actually the most innocent man we've ever had here. But that's what makes you the most valuable." She gave a signal. Another screen showed a video of Ross sitting at a police interrogation, desperately trying to explain what had happened. His words were met with laughter from the cops. The scene, edited and distorted, was already part of the women's twisted collection. "It's time for our final game," one of the women announced, pulling out a black bag. She slipped it over Ross's head, plunging him into darkness once again. When the bag was ripped off, Ross found himself on his knees in a spacious hall, dimly lit by just a few candles. In front of him stood Alice, holding a knife. The other women gathered around, their predatory gazes fixed on him, like hunters savoring their prey before the final strike. "You have a choice, Ross," Alice said with a sly smile. "You can try to escape. We'll even give you a head start. But you know how it'll end, don't you?" Before he could respond, Ross was forced down onto the floor, his body throbbing with pain. Yet, the worst agony was in his mind. He had no idea what they were planning next. The dark room filled with muffled laughter and whispers. The women took their time, savoring his fear. Alice knelt beside him, her eyes gleaming with a sinister satisfaction. She ran her hand gently across his face, as if admiring him, then leaned closer to whisper in his ear. "You never imagined it would end like this, did you?" Ross flinched, trying to pull his head away, but the cuffs bit into his skin, leaving no room for escape. The first blow to his spirit came unexpectedly. They surrounded him, and every movement drove him deeper into madness, crushed by his own helplessness. All he could do was watch, feel, and endure the unfolding nightmare. Alice and the other women took turns breaking his mind. For them, it wasn't just violence. It was power, their triumph over yet another man who became the latest victim of their games. His groans were drowned in the frenzy of their laughter, while the cameras meticulously captured every second. This was no longer just a game. It was a brutal display of dominance. When it was finally over, Ross lay on the floor, broken and exhausted, his gaze hollow and devoid of hope. Alice knelt beside him again, gently stroking his hair, as if bidding him a tender farewell. "You were the perfect finale for our little party," she murmured, her hand resting lightly on the knife that gleamed in her grasp. Without a hint of hesitation or remorse, she slashed his throat in one swift motion. Blood poured onto the floor, spreading in dark streams. Ross convulsed briefly and then went still. The camera captured his final moments before shutting off, leaving the room in darkness. The women rose slowly, as if finishing an ordinary dinner. In silence, they gathered their things and turned off the cameras. Each of them knew that this recording would be the most profitable one they had ever produced. Alice took one last look at Ross's lifeless body, a satisfied smile curling her lips. At last, she had achieved what she had always dreamed of: complete control over another person's life and death. "Well," she said, casting a glance at her friends, "now he knows who really holds the power here." They left the room, locking the door behind them. Only silence remained, bearing witness to the final act of cruelty that would forever be etched into the history of their twisted games. What do you think about this story? Leave a comment, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe. And remember, monsters often wear friendly faces.